History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 2 The First Civilizations. Chapter 4 Intruders and Invaders. The Dark Ages of the Ancient Near East. Representative art provides a little evidence about the Cretans' style of life. They seem to have dressed scantily, the women often being depicted bare breasted. The men are beardless. There is an abundance of flowers and plants to suggest a people deeply and readily appreciative of nature's gifts. They do not give the impression that Minoans found the world an unfriendly place. Their relative wealth, given the standards of ancient times, is attested by the rows of huge and beautiful oil jars found in their palaces. Their concern for comfort and what cannot but be termed elegance comes clearly through the dolphins and lilies which decorate the former apartments of a Minoan queen. Archaeology has also provided evidence of Minoan religious world. Though this does not perhaps take us very far since we have no texts. We have representations of gods and goddesses, but it is not easy to be sure who they are. Nor can we much penetrate their rituals beyond registering the frequency of sacrificial altars, sanctuaries in high places, double headed axes, and the apparent centering of Minoan cults in a female figure, though her relationship to other deities remains a mystery. She is perhaps a Neolithic fertility figure, such as was to appear again and again as the embodiment of female sexuality. The later Astarte and Aphrodite. In Crete, she appears elegantly skirted, bare breasted, standing between lions and holding snakes. Whether there was a male god too is less clear, but the appearance of bulls' horns in many places and the frescoes of these noble beasts is suggestive if it is linked to later Greek legend. Minos' mother, Europa, had been seduced by Zeus in the shape of a bull. His wife, Pasiphae, enjoyed a monstrous coitus with a bull, from which was born the half bull, half man, Minotaur, and to the obscure but obviously important rites of bull leaping. Sacrifice, it is clear, was important in Minoans' ritual attempts to achieve communion with their deity or deities, and there is evidence which, it has been argued, points to its inclusion of human victims, even of children, and perhaps of ritual consumption of their flesh. Yet, it is striking that whatever it was, Cretan religion does not seem to have made Minoans gloomy. Pictures of sports and dancing or delicate frescoes and pottery do not suggest an unhappy people. The political arrangements of this society are obscure. The palace was not only a royal residence but, in some sense, an economic center, a great store which may perhaps best be understood as the apex of an advanced form of exchange based on redistribution by the ruler. The palace was also a temple but not a fortress. In its maturity, it was the center of a highly organized structure whose inspiration may have been Asian. Knowledge of the literature and literate empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia were available to a trading people. One source of our knowledge of what Minoan government was trying to do is a huge collection of thousands of tablets which are its administrative records. They indicate rigid hierarchy and systematized administration, but not how this worked in practice. However effective government was, the only thing the records certainly show is what it aspired to, a supervision far closer and more elaborate than anything conceivable by the later Greek world. If there are any analogies, they are again with the Asian empires and Egypt. At present, the tablets tell us only of the past last phase of Minoan civilization because many of them cannot be read. The weight of scholarly opinion now inclines to the view, put forward a few years ago, that the script of a great mass of them found at Knossos is used to write Greek, and that they date from about 1450 to 1375 BC. The script in which they are written has been termed Linear B. The earlier written records are found at first in hieroglyph, with some symbols borrowed from Egypt, and then in another script, not yet deciphered, termed Linear A, and used from perhaps as early as 1700 BC. Almost certainly, it was wholly non Greek. Some have argued that incoming Greeks took over pre existing Minoan administrative practice and put down records such as were already kept in their own tongue. The earlier tablets probably contain information which is very like that in the later. But if so, it is about Crete before the coming of whoever presided over the last phase of mysterious end of Minoan civilization. Successful invasion from the European mainland would itself have been a sign that the conditions which had made this civilization possible were crumbling away in the troubled times of the closing Bronze Age. Crete for a long time had no rival to threaten her coasts. Perhaps the Egyptians had been too busy. In the north, there had long been no possible threat. Gradually, the second of these conditions had ceased to hold. Stirring on the mainland were others of those Indo European peoples who have already cropped up in so many places in this story. Some of them penetrated Crete again after the final collapse of the Knossos. They were apparently successful colonists who exploited the lowlands and drove away the Minoans and their shattered culture to lonely little towns of refuge, where they disappear from the stage of the world history. Ironically, only 2 or 3 centuries before this, Cretan culture had exercised something like hegemony in Greece, and Crete was always to hang about mysteriously at the back of Greek mind. A lost and golden land. A direct transfusion of Minoan culture to the mainland had taken place through the first Achaean peoples, the name usually given to these early Greek speakers, who came down into Attica and the Peloponnesus and established towns and cities there in the 17th and 18th centuries BC. They entered a land long in contact with Asia, whose inhabitants had already contributed to the future one, enduring symbol of Greek life, the fortification of the high place of the town or Acropolis. The new arrivals were culturally hardly superior to those they conquered, though they brought with them the horse and war chariot. They were barbarians by comparison with the Cretans, with no art of their own, more aware of the role of violence and war in society than were the islanders. No doubt because they did not enjoy the protection of the sea and had a sense of continuing pressure from the homelands from which they had come. They fortified their cities heavily and built castles. Their civilization had a military style. Sometimes they picked sites which were to be the later centers of Greek city states. Athens and Pylos were among them. They were not very large, the biggest containing at most not more than a few thousand people. One of most important was at Mycenae, which gave its name to the civilization that finally spread over Bronze Age Greece in the middle of the second millennium. It left some splendid relics, for it was very rich in gold. Strongly influenced by Minoan art, it was also a true synthesis of Greek and indigenous cultures on the mainland. Its institutional basis seems to have been rooted in patriarchal ideas, but there is more to it than that. the bureaucratic aspiration revealed by the Knossos tablets and by others from Pylos in the western Peloponnesos of about 1200 BC suggests currents of change flowing back from Crete towards the mainland. Each considerable city had a king. The king at Mycenae, presiding over a society of warrior landowners whose tenants and slaves were the aboriginal peoples, may have been at an early date the head of some sort of federation of kings. There are Hittite diplomatic records which suggest some degree of political cohesion in Mycenaean Greece. Below the kings, the Pylos tablets show a close supervision and control of community life, and also important distinctions between officials and, more fundamentally, between slave and free. What cannot be known is just what differences meant in practice, nor can we see much of the economic life that lay at the root of Mycenaean culture beyond its centralization in the royal household, as in Crete. Whatever its material basis, the culture represented most spectacularly at Mycenae had by 1400 BC spread all over mainland Greece and to many of the islands. It was a coherent whole, although well established differences of Greek dialect persisted and distinguished one people from another down to classical times. Mycenae replaced the Cretan trading supremacy in the Mediterranean with its own. It had trading posts in the Levant and was treated as a power by Hittite kings. Sometimes Mycenaean pottery exports replaced Minoan, and there are even examples of Minoan settlements being followed by Mycenaean. The Mycenaean Empire, if the term is permissible, was at its height in the 15th and 14th centuries BC. For a while, the weakness of Egypt and the crumbling of the Hittite power favored it. For a time, a small people enriched by trade had disproportionate importance while great powers waned. Mycenaean colonies were established on the shores of Asia Minor. Trade with other Asian towns, notably Troy, at the entrance to the Black Sea, prospered. But there are some signs of flagging from about 1300 BC. War seems to have been one answer. Achaeans took important parts in attacks on Egypt at the end of the century, and it now seems that a great raid by them, which was immortalized as the Siege of Troy, took place about 1200 BC. The troubled background to these events was a series of dynastic upheavals in the Mycenaean cities themselves. What can be called the dark ages of the Aegean were about to close in, and they are as obscure as what was happening in the Near East at about the same time. When Troy fell, new barbarian invasions of mainland Greece had already begun. At the very end of the 13th century, the great Mycenaean centers were destroyed, perhaps by earthquakes, and the first Greece broke up into disconnected settlements. As an entity, Mycenaean civilization collapsed, but not all the Mycenaean sites were abandoned, though their life continued at a lower level of achievement. The kingly treasures disappeared, the palaces were not rebuilt. In some places, the established resident peoples hung on successfully for centuries. Elsewhere, they were ruled as serfs or driven out by new conquerors from the north, who had been on the move from about a century before the fall of Troy. It does not seem likely that these new peoples always settled the lands they ravaged, but they swept away the existing political structures, and the future would be built on their kinships, not on the Mycenaean institutions. There is a picture of confusion as the Aegean Dark Age deepens. Only just before 1000 BC are there a few signs that a new pattern, the ground plan of classical Greece, was emerging. Legendary accounts of this attribute much to one particular group among the newcomers, the Dorians. Vigorous and bold they were to be remembered as the descendants of Heracles, though it is very dangerous to argue back from the presence of later Greek dialects to identifiable and compact groups of early invaders. Tradition makes them the speakers of a tongue, Doric, which lived on into the classical age as a dialect setting them apart. In this case, tradition has been thought by scholars to be justified. In Sparta and Argos, Dorian communities, which would be future city states, established themselves. But other peoples also helped to crystallize a new civilization in this obscure period. The most successful were those later identified as speakers of Ionic Greek, the Ionians of the Dark Age, setting out from Attica, where Athens had either survived or assimilated the invaders who followed Mycenae. They took root in the Cyclades and Ionia, the present Turkish coast of the Aegean. Here, as migrants and pirates, they seized or founded towns, if not on islands, almost always near or on the coast, which were the future city states of a seafaring race. Often the sites they chose had already been occupied by Mycenaeans. Sometimes, at Smyrna, for example, they displaced earlier Greek settlers. This is a confusing picture at best, and for much of it, there is only fragmentary evidence. Yet, from this turmoil, there would slowly re emerge the unity of civilization enjoyed by the Bronze Age Aegean. At first, though, there were centuries of disruption and particularism, a new period of provincialism in a once cosmopolitan world. Trade flagged and ties with Asia languished. What replaced them was the physical transference of people, sometimes taking centuries to establish new settled patterns, but in the end, setting out the ground plan of a future Greek world. Immediately, there was a colossal setback in civilized life, which should remind us how fragile it could be in ancient times. Its most obvious sign was a depopulation between 1100 and 1000 BC, so widespread and violent that some scholars have sought explanations in a sudden cataclysm, plague, perhaps, or a climactic change, such as might have suddenly and terribly reduced the small cultivable area of the Balkan and Aegean hillsides. Whatever the cause, the effects are to be seen also in a waning of elegance and skill. The carving of hard gems, the painting of frescoes, and the making of the fine pottery all come to a stop. Such cultural continuity as the age permitted must have been largely mental, a matter of songs, myths, and religious ideas. Of this troubled time, a very little is dimly and remotely reflected in the bardic epics later set down in writing in the Iliad and the Odyssey. They include material transmitted for generations by recitation, whose origins lie in tradition near contemporary with the events they purport to describe, though later attributed to one poet, Homer. Exactly what is reflected is much harder to agree about. The consensus has recently been that it is hardly anything for Mycenaean times and little more of what immediately followed them. The central episode of the Iliad, the attack on Troy, is not what matters here, though the account probably reflects a real preponderance of Achaean initiative in the settlement of Asia Minor. What survives is a little social and conceptual information carried accidentally by the poems. Though Homer gives an impression of some special preeminence enjoyed by the Mycenaean king, this is information about the post Mycenaean Aegean of the 8th century, when recovery from the Dark Ages begins. It reveals a society whose assumptions are those of barbarian warlords rather than those of rulers commanding regular armies or supervising bureaucracies like those of Asia. Homer's kings are the greatest of great nobles, the heads of large households, their acknowledged authority tempered by the real power of truculent near equals and measured by their ability to impose themselves. Their lives are troubled and exacting. The atmosphere is individualistic and anarchic. They are more like a band of Viking leaders than the rulers who ran their affairs with instruments like the Mycenaean tablets. Whatever reminiscences of detail may survive from earlier times, and these have sometimes been confirmed in their accuracy by excavation, and however many reflections of later society they eventually contained. The poems only fitfully illuminate a primitive society, still in confusion, settling down perhaps, but neither so advanced as Mycenae had been, nor even dimly foreshadowing what Greece was to become. The new civilization, which was at last to emerge from the centuries of confusion, owed much to the resumption of intercourse with the East. It was very important that the Hellenes, the name by which the invaders of Greece came to be distinguished from their predecessors, had spread out into the islands and onto the Asian mainland. They provided many points of contact between two cultural worlds, but they were not the only links between Asia and Europe. Seeds of civilization were always carried about by the go betweens of world history, the great trading peoples. One of them, another seafaring race, had a long and troubled history, though not so long as its legends said. The Phoenicians claimed that they had arrived in Tyre in about 2700 BC. This may be treated like stories about the descent of the Dorian kings from Heracles. Nonetheless, they were already settled on the coast of the modern Lebanon in the second millennium BC, when the Egyptians were getting supplies of cedar wood from them. The Phoenicians were a Semitic people. Like the Arabs of the Red Sea, they became seafarers because geography urged them to look outwards rather than inland. They lived in the narrow coastal strip, which was the historic channel of communication between Africa and Asia. Behind them was a shallow hinterland, poor in agricultural resources, cut up by hills running down from the mountains to the sea, so that the coastal settlements found it difficult to unite. There were parallels with the experience of later Greek states tempted to the sea in similar circumstances, and in each case, the result was not only trade but colonization. Weak at home, they came under the sway of Hebrew, Egyptian, and Hittite in turn. It cannot be entirely coincidental that the Phoenicians emerged from the historical shadows only after the great days of Egypt, Mycenae, and the Hittite Empire. They too prospered in others' decline. It was after 1000 BC, when the great era of Minoan trade was long past and the Phoenician cities of Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon had their brief golden age. Their importance then is attested by the biblical account of their part in the building of Solomon's temple. Thou knowest, says Solomon, that there is not amongst us any that can skill to hew timber like unto the Sidonians. And he paid up appropriately. 1 Kings 5 6. This is perhaps evidence of a unique, large, and spectacular public works contract in ancient times, and there is copious evidence later of the continuing importance of Phoenician enterprise. Ancient writers often stressed their reputation as traders and colonizers. They may have traded with the savages of Atlantic Europe. They were certainly skilled long distance navigators. Their dyes were long famous and much sought after even in classical times. No doubt, commercial needs stimulated Phoenician inventiveness. It was at Byblos, from which the Greeks were to take their name for a book, that the alphabet later adapted by the Greeks was invented. This was a great step, making a more widespread literacy possible. Yet no remarkable Phoenician literature survives. While Phoenician art tends to reflect their role of middleman, borrowing and copying from Asian and Egyptian models, perhaps as the customer demanded. Trade was the Phoenicians' preoccupation and did not at first require settlement overseas. Yet they came to base themselves more and more on colonies or trading stations, sometimes where Mycenaeans had traded before them. The furthest lay just beyond the entrance of the Mediterranean, where Gader was founded on the site of modern Cadiz to link Mediterranean to Atlantic trade and assure supplies of silver and tin. There were in the end some 25 such ports up and down the Mediterranean, the earliest set up at Kition, the modern Larnaca in Cyprus, at the end of the 9th century BC. Sometimes colonies followed earlier Phoenician commercial activity on the spot. They might also reflect the time of troubles which overtook the Phoenician cities after a brief phase of independence at the beginning of the first millennium. In the 7th century, Sidon was razed to the ground, and the daughters of the king of Tyre were carried off to the harem of the Assyrian Ashurbanipal. Phoenicia was then reduced to its colonies elsewhere in the Mediterranean and little else. Yet their establishment may also have reflected anxiety at the wave of Greek colonization in the West, which threatened the supply of metal, especially of British tin and Spanish silver. This could explain the Phoenician foundation of Carthage a century earlier. It was to become the seat of a power more formidable by far than Tyre and Sidon had ever been, and went on to establish its own chain of colonies. Further west, beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, Cadiz was already known to Phoenicians who called there while looking for an Atlantic trade further north. The Phoenicians were among the most important traffickers in civilization, but so willy nilly had been others. The Mycenaeans by their diffusion of a culture, and the Hellenes by their stirring up of the ethnic world of the Aegeans. The Cretans had been something more, true originators. They not only took from the great established centers of culture, but remade what they took before diffusing it again. These peoples helped to shape a more rapidly changing world, one important side effect of which little has yet been said was the stimulation of continental Europe. The search for minerals slowly took explorers and prospectors further and further into that unknown. Already in the second millennium, there are the first signs of a complicated future. Beads found in Mycenae were manufactured in Britain from Baltic amber. Trade was always slowly at work, eating away isolation, changing people's relations with one another, imposing new shapes on the world. But it is hard to relate this story to the stirring of the ethnic pot in the Aegean, let alone to the troubled history of Asian mainland from the second millennium BC.